Welcome everyone to our next session during this study on suffering and kind of the human condition. Today, what I want to talk about a little bit in our third session is what's the role of faith to suffering, and maybe specifically what's the role of faith in the process of dying. What's the role of faith in human death? I'm always interested to learn and read about famous American authors, and probably one of the most famous authors. As a matter of fact, he's sometimes in some circles called the greatest American author, was a man named Herman Melville, and the most famous book that he ever wrote was a novel about a great sea captain, and it was the book Moby Dick. And if you've ever read that story like I had to back in high school, you can remember about Captain Ahab and his adventures trying to catch this great whale in the ocean. And when you look at it, if you get a chance to read it in the future, when you look at that book, there's all kinds of theological references in that book, including the very opening line of the book is a reference to the Bible, where Melville starts off the very first sentence he puts in the book is this: "Call me Ishmael." And that's a reference to a character in the Old Testament, not a very well-known character, but Ishmael was actually the firstborn of Abraham, who Abraham tries to kind of circumvent having children with his wife. So he decides to have a child with one of his slaves. And the story of Ishmael is really the story of a wanderer. It's somebody who's basically, they're the firstborn of the family, but they're not treated that way. They're not treated the way that a firstborn should be treated. Ishmael is a traveler. He's a sojourner. And maybe that's kind of what Melville was getting at in his portrayal of Captain Ahab, how Captain Ahab really didn't feel like he had a home to go to, but he was always on the search for this great whale named Moby Dick. But in one of his letters, Melville wrote a couple things, and one of his letters he wrote this about suffering that's always stuck with me, and I've remembered this quote from him for a long time. He said this: "Unless we realize that one grief can overcome 1,000 joys, we won't understand what Christianity is trying to make us into." Now, I don't really know much about his personal life. I don't know if he had a lot of suffering and trauma in his personal life. But my guess is that by that statement, Herman Melville understood a little bit, at least, about human suffering. And maybe that's kind of where he's coming from when he writes some of his great novels that we know and treasure today. So today, what I want to do is ask two questions. And you might call them the ultimate questions of suffering and of turmoil. And those questions are when and how. It's interesting that we seldom ask the question if we will die, or we seldom ask the question why we will die. But most people, when it comes to the issue of death, the two questions that most are on their mind is they want to know when, and they want to know how. We don't seem to be interested in the if or the why, which maybe in and of itself is kind of interesting because, why doesn't it bother people that everyone dies? We have that old phrase in America that there's two things you can count on: death and taxes. But it doesn't seem to bother anybody that everybody dies. Now, it doesn't seem to bother anybody that we have to pay have to pay taxes. Of course, as I think about it, only about 50% of Americans are paying taxes. So maybe that's part of the problem. But it's similar, I think, to the phrase "nobody's perfect." We all may agree with that phrase, but the tragedy in our world is that it doesn't seem to bother anybody that nobody's perfect. We just seem to take it for granted. But when we talk about the when and the how in regards to our death, those seem to be kind of the more significant concerns for us. And I think the same is true kind of in the Bible. The Bible doesn't seem to be usually interested a whole lot in the mannerism or the method of how a person dies, but rather the Bible seems to be more interested in kind of what's the state of a person's soul, what's a person's relationship to God when it comes down to the issue of death. You know, what is their relationship that comes back in their relationship to faith, and what's their relationship to God at the moment of their death. One of the things that bothers me about medical professionals in our day and age is the doctor or the medical profession who somehow thinks that they can predict how long a person with terminal cancer has left. I mentioned, I think in the first session that we had, my brother-in-law out in Seattle, he died recently of pancreatic cancer. And not only was that going on a couple of weeks recently, but I also heard in the last week, just before recording this session, that another one of the great giants of the Reformed faith, Tim Keller up at Redeemer Presbyterian in Manhattan, he also was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer just recently. And but you know, in my brother-in-law's case, I can remember that, you know, whenever I would talk to my sister-in-law and some of my family members up there, I can remember them saying that the doctors kept saying that he only had a few weeks, you know, that it was going to be any moment. And then of course, a few weeks turned into a few months, and and a few months turned into almost 6 months. And those weeks would go by, and then the doctors would come back and say, well, still, it's only a few more weeks. You know, they would keep saying the same thing over and over, and it didn't seem to really dawn on them that, you know, maybe they don't really know how long a terminal person has left, and so maybe they should, you know, just kind of keep their mouth shut. But more and more people we know are surviving diseases or are surviving longer in diseases that were thought to be terminal. And we also know that people can respond to different types of medications. So people don't just, you know, roll over and give up when they contract a certain disease. And you know, we don't know if an ailment that a person has will be the last one. We don't, you know, what the last time I got the flu, I didn't know whether or not that was it. I certainly didn't feel like it was going to be my last disease. But you know, we even when we do recover, that doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to somehow escape the final moment of our lives and somehow escape death. So we kind of go back and forth as individuals, as human beings, in terms of trying to find this balance of, you know, on one hand, believing that, yes, everybody's going to die, we're going to die eventually. But on the other hand, we're very adamant sometimes, and we struggle against that process. And when I kind of look at different examples in the Bible, one of the things that I kind of notice is that it's not so much concerned as to how people die, such as, you know, the thing that caused their death, like a car accident, or heart congestive failure, or cancer, or a gunshot, or something like that. The question that the Bible seems more preoccupied with is the question of what's the state of a person's soul when they have their last breath. I can remember several examples in the last century. Just recently, I was listening to a short podcast on church history, and one of the characters that was talked about this last week was a famous theologian from Princeton Theological Seminary, back when it was still a Bible-based conservative evangelical seminary, which it is not that today. But his name was Benjamin Breckinridge Warfield. And one of the things that I did not know about him, two things actually I did not know about him, was that when he got married, I think he got married at like the age of 25. And for some reason, he and his wife had an opportunity to go on this long, you know, very long extended honeymoon over in Europe. So they were in Europe for almost an entire year on their honeymoon. Now I'm right now, am gearing up for my honeymoon, which thanks to the church is both combined with my vacation time and some sabbatical time. So I'm calling it a 3-month honeymoon. And I think that's pretty generous. But B.B. Warfield got to go for a whole year on his honeymoon. And one of the things that happened while they were over there is they were in Germany, they were in the mountains, and there was a severe lightning storm that came up. And his young wife they weren't injured, they weren't struck by lightning or anything like that, they weren't physically injured, but she was so traumatized by the lightning storm that she I guess kind of had basically an emotional or a mental breakdown from that storm, and never ever recovered throughout the whole rest of her life. And B.B. Warfield kind of spent a huge portion of his life caring and tending to this young wife, and cared for her her whole life, because she had this terrible experience in a thunderstorm as a young person. But the second story I didn't know about him is that when he died, the story goes like this, that he was just walking kind of through the campus, and one day he just sat down on a bench. It was a beautiful day out, and he sat down on the bench kind of to look at the trees, and suddenly he just kind of slumped over and he breathed his last. Now, I thought to myself, that's a good way for a person to go. Another example of a person dying that kind of gets more to the point of what I'm talking about today was another seminary professor. This one was from Pittsburgh Theological Seminary, Dr. Graham, not to be confused with Billy Graham. This guy's name was Tom Graham, and he was a professor at Pittsburgh Seminary, again back kind of in its heyday before it became a very liberal, left-leaning organization. And he'd been, for many years, even while he taught, he'd been sick with cancer. And on his tombstone, I heard this story, that on his tombstone was a very popular and very common epitaph that I've seen on many tombstones throughout my life. I'm sure you have as well. But it was the epitaph that said, "Died in faith." And when I was thinking about this lesson today, I thought, what does that phrase mean, to die in faith? The people who wrote that on his tombstone certainly weren't concerned about how Dr. Graham died, such as cancer or heart failure or an accident. But it seemed like, whoever decided that should be on a person's tombstone were more concerned about the statement or about the state of a person's soul. And we see that same idea about dying in faith. We see that echoed all throughout the Bible in different characters, famous, well-known characters: Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, David. They're all popular characters of people who died in faith. And they were people who trusted God. And again, they didn't just trust God for a moment or when it was convenient, but they trusted God for the long haul. They were people who, started their lives off as early. They understood that the Christian life is not necessarily a 100-yard dash. It's a marathon. I make no secret that I do a lot of running in my daily routine in my exercise. And now that the weather's starting to heat up, it's getting a little bit more difficult to go out running, just because it's so humid here in South Florida right now. But it's that idea that, the people who die in faith, they weren't just Christians by nominally. They weren't just Christians in name only. They weren't just Christians on Sunday morning, but it was something that for them permeated every single element of their being. Now, true story, and I think I probably can speak for most other ministers on this, is that one of the common things that ministers have to do, especially ministers in a town with a lot of older people, is one of our responsibilities is to now and then do either a funeral service or a memorial service. And of course, the old joke that for a lot of people in our country, there are only 3 times when they go into a church, and 2 of those times they're being carried. And those 2 times refer to when they're being carried in for baptism as a baby, and the other time they're being carried in is when they're being carried in a casket to go to their funeral. But I've done my fair share of memorials, and to be honest, I've done funerals and memorial services for people who I'll be totally honest. It was not clear to me where where the state of that person's soul was when they died. And to be honest, on more than one occasion, I've probably, and I know other ministers who have done this as well, so I don't feel that bad, but I've probably glossed over or maybe sometimes sugarcoated the reality of the person who was deceased, just because you don't want to upset the family that's still there. Or maybe kind of made excuses about the reality of that person, when in all likelihood, the person who is deceased probably, there probably is a chance that they're not in heaven. But sometimes for the sake of the remaining family and the people who are still grieving, you try to focus on positive things, and also things like making sure that the people who are still there hear the message of the gospel, and that might be the only time in their lives they're going to hear that message. So that's kind of an unusual element that sometimes ministers have to go through. Another person who he wasn't dead at the time, but he's died since then, is another Dr. Graham. And this, of course, is the more famous one, whose name was Billy Graham. Billy Graham grew up as a Presbyterian. He lived very close to a well-known Presbyterian college in North Carolina called Montreat Presbyterian College. And I've had the joy of going there for a couple retreats. They have great summer retreats up there every summer. It's a beautiful campus. And he lives kind of up in the foothills just outside of Asheville. And I'm not sure I've ever, even though he lived there, for most of Billy Graham's ministry, the headquarters building was actually not in North Carolina. It wasn't near Asheville. It was actually in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And if you ever watched one of his old crusades, you may remember that when at the end of the crusade, at the end of the television program, when they told you to write somewhere, the P.O. box was always Minneapolis, Minnesota. And I may not have mentioned this, but I think for a summer or two, my dad, kind of between some of his college years where he was going down there and he went to Northwestern College for a while, and might have been after college, he actually worked there at the headquarters for the Billy Graham Association. I think most of what he did was just drive. He was just a chauffeur. He drove people back and forth from the airport, kind of like, executives and that type of thing. But, people who have, and I certainly never got to see, I did have a chance to go to a crusade when I was in high school, and I didn't have time to go to it, so I didn't. But I had many friends who did go to it there in the Metrodome. And one of the things that a lot of people who knew him or who had visited him personally, like my dad, would comment, because my dad would see him when he'd pick him up at the airport and things like that. And one of the things that people would comment on was how tall he was. And, even when you saw him like on national television, if you saw him with other people, he usually was head and shoulders taller than all of the other people who were on stage with him. And I can remember, watching television specials back in the 70s and the early 80s, and you might have a kind of a birthday party celebration or an anniversary set, and they'd have all these celebrities there on the television program. And guess what? Billy Graham would be included as one of these celebrities. It was kind of a time when there wasn't so much pushback between Christianity and Hollywood. And for some, don't ask me how or why I remember this, but I can remember a nationally televised birthday party. It was the 90th birthday party for the actor and comedian George Burns. Now, the irony, and so they had all these celebrities, all these famous actors. They had Dean Martin on there. They had Frank Sinatra, Sammy Davis Jr., and of course, and they had Billy Graham. Now, the irony is that, George Burns was not probably the most religious person in the world. He did star in a series of movies called Oh God, where he played the role of God, and then in the sequel, he played both the role of God and the devil. But that's probably about his, he was from a Jewish background, but he was not a practicing Jew in any way, shape, or form. But nevertheless, Billy Graham gets invited to his nationally televised birthday party, and each of the celebrities would come up to him on camera, and they kind of have a few words with him. right on camera to kind of wish him a happy birthday and maybe give him some advice. And so, of course, the big question that everybody in the audience was waiting for was this: what is Billy Graham going to say to George Burns here on national TV? Because George Burns was kind of known as being a bit of a jokester about religion, and also kind of known for being a little bit crude and inappropriate at times in his humor. And I can still remember in that particular vignette when Billy Graham came up, and the first thing that George Burns asked him was whether or not he'd be able to have his cigars in heaven. And if you ever watched George, he was always smoking a big fat cigar, and he wanted Billy Graham's opinion on whether or not he was going to be able to take his cigars to heaven. And of course, Billy Graham responded. This was the first time I'd heard this, and I've used this joke many, many times over the years, but this is the first place I heard it. Billy Graham responded by saying, "Well, cigars aren't going to send you to hell, but you'll just smell like you've been there." And of course, everybody laughed, and I've used that joke several times. Well, needless to say, right after that, Billy Graham went after George Burns, and I mean, he went after George Burns with both barrels loaded, right there on national TV, despite the fact that it was on national TV, despite the fact it was his 90th birthday. And he jumped right in on George Burns, and he asked him point blank, "George, are you right with God?" And of course, that was the last thing in the world that George Burns expected to hear on his 90th birthday, and in front of a national televised audience. And you could tell it kind of threw him for a loop, and he struggled to kind of respond to that question. He kind of kept Billy Graham at a arm's length a little, and kind of kept him at a distance. But it certainly looked very funny on national TV. And I thought to myself, I thought that Billy Graham might say something like you hear him say in one of his crusades, like that goes like, "If you came on a bus, George, I'm sure it'll wait for you outside," or George, why don't we just sing a few more verses of "Just As I Am" while we all wait for you to make your decision. But I can remember even and I was just a little kid when this all happened, but I can remember even as a little kid how impressed I was that Billy Graham had the courage, even on national television, to confront him like that. And years later, I found out that Billy Graham, even after that moment, had kind of gone out of his way to maintain a relationship with George Burns until the very end, until George Burns was right at death's door. And that he had not just, inquired of him on national TV, but he had gone out of his way to keep that relationship going, and to try and follow up. He just didn't make it kind of a one-time shot in the dark type situation. And that's that kind of, relational evangelism that I think is in many ways missing in a lot of our churches these days. And that, I think one of the reasons that sticks in my mind is because, the Bible talks about death and suffering. It kind of talks about death and suffering in two ways. The first way are those who die in faith. Okay, I've given a few examples about that, both people from the Bible and from the 20th century. And another example is what you might call people who die in their sins. What does that mean, to die in sins? Is there something that the Bible says about that? Or is there something we don't know? It sounds so tragic to read. Imagine reading in the newspaper in the obituary page that so-and-so died, and they died in sin. Aren't we all in a sense sinners? Well, of course that's true. We're in a sense, we're all sinners, and there's a sense in which we we all die in sin, because sin is not something that leaves us until we leave this world, until we get to heaven. That's the only time we'll be able to be free of it. But the Bible, I think, does make kind of a distinction in terms of at the time of our death, whether or not we've done what Billy Graham asked George Burns. Have we gotten right? Have we settled things with God? And the Bible even describes, people who even at the last moment of their lives, and this is maybe the tragedy part of dying in sin, it's people who even in their last breath, they still refuse to submit to the things of God. Even when they're right at the finish line, they simply flat out refuse to acknowledge God as their creator. I can remember probably the most significant loss that I've had in my life was my grandfather, Art Klostreich. He was a railroad man up in Mandan, North Dakota. He was a diehard fisherman. I think he's probably the one who kind of spoiled my appetite for fish because when we would go, my brother and I would go out fishing with him there on the Missouri River, and he would always make us watch him clean the fish afterwards. And I think it's watching him clean and fillet the fish that kind of took away my appetite. And since then, I've never been a big fan of seafood, so I don't eat it even to this day. But his death was not sudden. It was not a surprise. It was very long. It was many years of ailments, of problems, of various falls and various illnesses. And what struck me is that towards the end, he kind of had a pattern. He would get up out of bed and he would go to this big recliner that was in the living room, and it kind of looked out onto this big bay window, and he could see the front yard and the street and the cars going by on the street from his front window, and he would see the paper boy come and deliver the paper. That was high excitement in his day. And I can remember that, especially towards the last couple years of his life, he made a point of always having a Bible by his chair and reading it. He did a lot more Bible reading the closer he got to the end. And I think what surprised me is that, for most of his life, he went to church. I knew he was a Christian, but he wasn't particularly an avid Bible reader when he was healthy, when he was the picture of perfect health. I don't recall him reading his Bible that much. But as he got to the end, it seemed like that was the thing that really he wanted to latch onto. He wanted to latch onto towards the very end. Speaking of the Bible, let me make a reference here to a verse that comes to us from 2 Timothy. This is one of Paul's final verses that he ever wrote in his lifetime. We think that 2 Timothy is probably the last letter that he wrote. And he says this in chapter 4. He says, "I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race, and I have kept the faith." Elsewhere in the same chapter, he talks about his life being poured out as a drink offering. So you can kind of guess that Paul has the sense that any day he's going to be executed. And we know that he was executed. He was put to death by Emperor Nero. But the first thing he says is he talks about fighting a good fight. And one of the things that I think gets missed in this discussion sometimes about illness and suffering and death is that fighting against illness is a good thing. Fighting against death is a good fight. We should make every attempt that we can to recover from just because somebody gets ill, just because you and I get ill, doesn't mean we have to just give in and let it run its course and let it take our lives from us. We should do everything we can to try and recover. Speaking of my brother-in-law out in Seattle, Saul, he when he learned that he had pancreatic cancer, he traveled all over the world trying to find different options. He went to Johns Hopkins, I think, on the East Coast, seeing if he could be part of a kind of an experimental treatment. He tried different things from he tried as much, I think, as it's humanly possible to try. And I'm not sure that, giving into disease without putting up any fight or resistance, I don't think that necessarily brings honor to God or anything like that. So fighting an illness, fighting death and disease, I think is a good fight. And so Paul talks about fighting the good fight. And then he talks about the idea of being in a race, and in the context that he's in, the race, that the language that's in the Greek is really the term that refers to endurance. He's talking about this long race. Christianity, I think most ministers will tell you, isn't a 100-yard sprint. It's a marathon. And I think it's that way for most people. And and the reason I say that is because it's easy. Anybody can be a Christian for 5 minutes. That's easy. Anybody can be. Right now when I run a 5K race, it takes me between 20 and 22 minutes to run that race. That's if I'm really pushing it and if I'm trying hard, and I've done some conditioning beforehand. But anybody can be a Christian for 22 minutes. That's not hard. But Paul describes the Christian life in terms of a marathon, not necessarily a short sprint. Now I have to acknowledge that in my own observation, and I can. People who are listening to this lesson in our church probably kind of know who they are and kind of who I'm talking about. I've discovered a noticeable number of people in our church who they didn't have the option of growing up in a Bible believing church for most of their lives. They grew up maybe in a very liberal church, or maybe they didn't grow up in a church at all, or they didn't grow up in a church that taught kind of the principles of the Reformation. They didn't grow up in Reformed theology. And what I've noticed, and this is mainly older people who I've noticed are in our church who kind of have this trait, is that once they recognize kind of the void that was in their upbringing, once they recognize the richness of Reformed theology and how that's been missing from their lives. You want to know what I've discovered about them? They are, even though they're older in life, they may not have many years left, they are sprinting to the finish line. They are running and what I mean by that is that they come to every Bible study that they can possibly get to. They come to men's Bible study. They come to church on Sunday morning. They come to Sunday school. They come on Wednesday night when they can. They come to every possible opportunity they can to get that Reformed theology, to get that Calvinism that's been missing in their lives. They've been taught all kinds of different ideas about the Bible, but they've never been taught Reformed theology that kind of puts it all together. And so, we have I would say we've got a good number of people in our church who kind of fit that description. They didn't really grow up in a Calvinistic tradition. And now that they're in one at Palm City Presbyterian, I kid you not, they're sprinting towards the finish line. And it's a great thing to watch and a great thing to see. And then Paul ends his statement by saying that he's kept the faith. Okay, what does that mean? Well, that's kind of what I was referring to at the very beginning of our lesson, that the great men and women of the faith, they were people who were in it for the long haul. And also they realized that Christian faith is not magic or superstition. To be honest, if there was one word that I could use to describe the Christian faith, it would be the word trust. Okay? That's all faith is. You're trusting, and you're not just trusting in the concept of God. You don't just trust in God, but you trust God. Dr. Sproul used to make a big deal about the difference between believing in God, which probably 97, 98% of the people on this planet believe in God. But he said that there was a difference between believing in God and believing God. Those are two radically different things. It's one thing to trust in God, but it's another thing to trust God. And so our desire should be that at the moment of our death, we're trusting not just in God, but we're also trusting God. When we speak about death, we also have to speak about the other side as well. And one of the oldest questions that we have in the Bible goes like this: if a man dies, will he live again? Why on earth would you and I have any reason to hope that there's life beyond death? Why would we have any reason to hope that there's something after dust to dust? I can remember when I was in the first church, the first Presbyterian church I worked in had a little bit more liturgy than Palm City does. And one of the things that they had in their worship service was called the assurance of salvation. And in their liturgy, they would have kind of a prayer of confession, which was either written out or you would just be kind of given a quiet time for about a minute where everybody, confessed their sins. And then always after that came the thing that was called the assurance of salvation, where the minister would get up and would recite a scripture verse that kind of reminded people that yes, God has forgiven their sins, and would assure them that yes, there is something that's waiting for us. And the irony of that is that a lot of people today, both inside the church and out, think that we can't really be sure about our destiny. And truth be told, if I were to ask you the question, if you died tonight, do you know that you would go to heaven? That's kind of the old evangelism explosion question. To be honest, there's a lot of different answers to that question. You could say no. You could say, I don't know. You could say, I hope so. You could say, I think so. You could say, my friends think so. You could say, my wife thinks so. That might be a little bit better. You could say, yes. You could say, absolutely. And if you notice, each one of those answers has a different level of confidence attached to it. There's a different level of assurance attached to each one of those answers. But even the person who answers absolutely, even if that were me, I have to remind myself that the scariest verse in the whole Bible comes at the end of the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 7, where Jesus says, on that day, many will say to me, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name and cast out demons in your name and do many mighty works in your name? And Jesus' response to them is not very positive. He basically tells them, get lost. I never knew. And the scary part is that Jesus is basically saying that there are people, both then and now, who are so convinced that they're saved, but they actually aren't. Okay? They're more convinced about what they're doing rather than the relationship. And it's people who are not saved, but they don't know it. Now, once in a while, some people might think that it's somehow arrogant. Think that a person who is confident about going to heaven when they die, maybe we should be suspicious of that person. Maybe they're being arrogant. And is it possible to be arrogant about your eternal salvation? Is it possible to be arrogant about going to heaven? And to be honest, I think it is. Sometimes, and I think there are people all over this world, both inside the church and outside the church, who basically think that the reason they're going to heaven is not because of what Jesus has done, but it's because what they've done. They think they're going to, and I'll see this all the time, where people will say, I'm going to heaven because I'm basically a good person, or they'll say that about something else. So-and-so is going to heaven. I know they are because they're basically a good person. And to be honest, we see that all throughout the church as well. Both in Protestantism and in Catholicism. I mean, Pastor Brad, look at all the times I've gone to church. Look at all the money I've given to poor people living out in the most remote parts of Africa. Look at all those Sunday school. I mean, Pastor Brad, I taught middle school Sunday school for 10 years. Surely that counts for something, right? Guess what? That may look good on a resume, but that is not enough. That is not going to count anything towards getting you into heaven. And the sad reality is that I would probably guess the vast majority of Christians think that way. That's the type of view they have of their eternal destiny. They think that because they've done more good things than they have bad things, that God is somehow obligated to let them into heaven. So that's one sign of arrogance. But there's another part of arrogance that kind of works its way in through what I might call a sense of false humility, and that's the idea of rejecting God's offer of eternal life. If I listen to the offer of the gospel, I listen to the message of the gospel, and I reject that message, that truth claim of the Bible, then I would say that's the ultimate form of arrogance. If God promises eternal life to me, and yet I'm not sure about his promises, then I'm basically, then I'm unquestioningly arrogant in my questioning of the veracity of God's promises. I've basically put myself on a higher par than God, and that's even more arrogant than the person who thinks they're getting in by their works. So as we kind of wrap up, let me wrap up this session. I kind of want to ask two questions that are maybe thoughts to consider during this week before we have our next session. And the first question is this: when you feel a void of personal assurance in your life, or when have those moments been when you don't really feel a whole lot of confidence about how your life is going to turn out? When have those moments been? What are the times that you don't have a strong sense of your assurance of pardon? When are the times when you don't really have a strong sense of whether or not you're going to go to heaven? And then the second question goes like this: what kinds of things that happen in your life, what are the things that happen in your daily experience or in your weekly, monthly experience that kind of shake your confidence and maybe disturb your assurance or in the promises of God? What are the things that happen in your life that kind of make you start to question whether or not God's promises are going to come true? Now an easy answer to that one, and one that we can probably all think of right off the bat, is when there's a major tragedy. Okay, when there's a major tragedy like 9/11, or like the Titanic, or even something like when President Kennedy was shot. Those, even right now, what's going on in our own world right now with a lot of civil unrest, a lot of questioning about the police departments and things like that. You know, those are things that usually cause a lot of people to question or to shake their confidence in the promises of God. So think about those kind of two questions during this week, and maybe I'll try and provide some answers in our next session next week, which is going to be a little bit about kind of what's the nature of heaven. What is it we're looking forward to when we get to heaven? There's a lot of different descriptions in the Bible about what heaven's like. And we're going to look at some of those and kind of maybe give us a little sneak peek to what we can maybe expect when you and I finally pass over that line and cross that finish line and breathe our last. Thanks again for listening. This is Pastor Brad signing out one more time and finishing with our third installment of our series on suffering. And I hope you guys are having a great week. And now that we're back in church, back with live services, it's great to see everybody face to face again. Have a great week, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.